So last time we started discussing that what we'd seen earlier was basically how to design the technology artifact itself, right? In terms of the user interface, data privacy, algorithms, and then also consider the wider system design, right? That how does this technology system affect the rest of the world, affect the social relationships between different stakeholders that interact with it, yeah? And we saw that this design process itself, that how do we map who are the different stakeholders, how do we map what sort of structural injustices should algorithms take into account, right, for deciding fairness on race or gender, for example. Similarly, right, what privacy preferences do users have, how to discover these preferences and to take them into account. And right, same with user interfaces, that what is right. So with nudges, for example, we say that we can use nudges if they are good for overall welfare, right? But who defines, how do we discover this welfare, right? So we said that, well, this design process itself has to be managed ethically. And on this front, one significant framework is that of value sensitive design, which basically says that, well, there are many different values, and it talks about processes to discover these values, right? That, right, how to talk to users or how to design prototypes so that we can discover these values. We can work in participatory ways with the users to discover these values and figure out which ones to take into account, right? So that's what we were discussing, and one of the points that we caveat sort of that we discussed, and which we'll revisit again when we talk in more detail about design methods in general, is that getting participation is not that straightforward, right? Because who is able to participate, that itself might be governed by who has the time to participate, for example. Similarly, how open are you in voicing your preferences while participating, that itself is affected by existing inequities, right? So it's not that straightforward, but I mean, this is one of the best things that we have, right? Then another aspect was that even though we might want to be participatory, but sometimes it's not that straightforward also because of the way organizations are set up, right? Organizations are essentially set up through a division of labor method, and which essentially isolates users from designers and from engineers, where everybody is able to come together and consultatively discover right things to do. That is not always easy. And finally, the third thing that we saw, that again design at the design stage, it's very difficult to get it right, is affordances of technology, right? Because the same technology can be used in many different ways. So it's not very easy to get that right, because right, you can't think of all eventualities. People might discover loopholes, right? And so yesterday I shared some of these articles which we've talked about previously also, like with related to Aadhaar and biometric authentication for cash withdrawal, right? So one of the right affordances that essentially the technology allows is that the person who's using the POS machine, they need not communicate the results to the person they're authenticating, right? So essentially what was happening was that they were taking thumbprints from people, and they were saying that the transaction has failed, and they would take a thumbprint again and say that the transaction has failed, right? Now the user wasn't able to figure out what was actually happening, so they just kept authenticating again and again. And what was actually happening is that these transactions were successful, and the amount was being debited from the beneficiary's account, and basically the person using the biometric machine was basically pocketing all of that money, right? So this is another example, right, where affordances, right, you won't get them right from the very beginning, right? And therefore it means that you need to be iterative, you need to take user feedback and keep doing all of that, right, again and again, to continuously keep improving the design, right? So it's essentially, right, a moving target. You can't get it right in one shot, right? So that was more in terms of management of the design process itself, right? And then the second thing that we started seeing is that it's not just that you need to affect the design, right, but you would need to manage the deployment itself, right? So like with artificial intelligence, we've seen that right, different unfairness issues can come in. You might need to retrain your data, you might need new data sets for retraining so that sampling biases can be corrected, right? So all of that basically means that you have to first keep an eye on what's going wrong, and then try and keep improving. Yeah. So right now, how do you keep an eye on what's going wrong? Right. You essentially need feedback. Right. You need feedback from the users to come in, and then you want to incorporate this feedback. So one of the points, right, very much like it with participatory design, so that your design process, the design that you come up with has been done thoughtfully. In the same way, we are talking about management beyond the design process, which also requires user involvement, right? Right. And here we started talking about content moderation as one place where user involvement is required, right? I'll just mention that again. Right now, in the same way, I briefly spoke about some of our experiences with Gramvani, right, where again, right, we had to discover all of this as we went along, right, that what social inequities were being reproduced through our technology. And we discovered this, and then we steered the technology and the processes accordingly. Right. Similarly, we tried to deal with this remoteness between designers and users, where right there's essentially a remoteness, a distance that exists. Right. We are sitting here in Delhi. Our users are in rural areas. Right. So how do we discover, right, what is it that users want? So we had to set up various methods by recruiting volunteers on the ground who could report back on user needs, or who could actually have the affordances to, so that they could shape the use of the technology themselves rather than us telling them what can you do with it. Right. We also had to take care of incentives so that misuse is prevented through the right signaling mechanisms, through content moderation, and then do other downstream tasks. Right. So if you think about it from the algorithms module that we saw, right, there are certain upstream inequities which algorithms can reproduce, and then there are certain downstream implications of these algorithms in terms of what changes they bring in society. Right. So you have to work on all fronts. Right. You have to work on all fronts so that the technology which is sitting in the middle, right, here you're taking some upstream inequities into account in the technology model itself, and you're also taking possible downstream consequences into account so that you can continuously keep improving and steering the mechanism, right? So that was some of the things that you have to do. Then we also briefly saw that the reason why it is very hard is essentially because here you're assuming that, well, you can model the whole world, you can think about what will happen, right, which is the rationalistic mindset. And right, we saw several examples, right, from how development, for example, has been defined by the West to how the state governments see the use of technology. And we basically saw that this rationalist method is not, need not be complete, right? There will be, right, the world is complex, it's not that straightforward to model all of it, and therefore you will need this constant steering, right? So, right, so the bottom line being that both to come up with a good design, you need user participation and you need to manage the design process. And similarly, irrespective of how good a design you've created, you still need to be very mindful of the wider implications, and you need to keep steering, right? And user participation is one way to do that. Yeah. We saw that, okay, now let us understand that to create this user participation, right, is that straightforward, or what issues does that face itself, right? So here we started looking at this case study of content moderation, right, where users are involved in management, where they can flag content, right? But some of the criticism that was created was that this flagging of content is not, again, right, it's done on predefined categories, the vocabulary is constrained. While it can be an opportunity to create debate, right, it's not seen like that. Rather, right, so it's not, it doesn't create what we've earlier discussed as agonistic spaces where debate actually exists. Rather, the design is that you just flag whatever you think is inappropriate, and then somebody else, Facebook, for example, or their content moderators just make a decision, and all evidence is actually removed of whether such content even existed earlier. Right. Now, contrast that with Wikipedia, which is a more agonistic space where all the disagreement is actually made visible. So, right. So this offers an opportunity for learning as well. Right. So again, the point being that joint management by users is not that straightforward. And right now, trying to get this right can be a very time-taking process as well, right? So content moderation, for example, right? It's not that it's a solved problem, It's not even a just a pure technological problem, but right through processes, through experience, right, we can do better and better. And then one of the ways in which we were talking about is that because it's not just purely technological, right? You can't, right, just by building AI-driven methods to detect fake news, right? Those things are not going to work in entirety, right? You will always get it wrong because of these complexities, right? So you need to augment it with also certain institutional processes. And one of the ways is very much like how we do it in Gramvani, that right users are involved in the setup. We try and create institutions where volunteers, for example, who represent the community, right, they can discuss and debate about content. They can discuss and debate about policies, what to favor, what not to favor, because it is all very context dependent. And if you give them the power to do so, right, so if you create these institutions, then these institutions can discover ways to govern their spaces in a good way, right? So essentially, this article talks about why Facebook's approach is inherently limited because they don't create these institutions. They don't give the kind of tools that content moderators can use, and neither do they offer that kind of a training and support so that some of these content moderators can really become champions of developing ways to govern individual public spheres. Yeah. So Reddit, for example, does a much better job in this sense, right? So these are right different ways in which we can think about it, right? It's not just about creating institutions, but for example, also in mentoring, right? So when it comes to content moderation, then media literacy becomes very important, right? So anybody, right, even when you're creating institutions, so the administrators of these forums need to be aware of certain basic media literacy issues and also to inculcate this among the users, right? So for example, this article talks about several points that low literacy in the demographic in rural or low income communities, right? Over there, smartphones and social media are new phenomena. And there's a inherent tendency to believe something visual is quite instinctive. So it's like, right, they never got an opportunity to learn through mistakes, right? That's one of the reasons why things like fake news have had such huge impacts, right, pretty much around the world. And so we've had this discussion of how it's actually threatening democracy itself. So good journalism takes time. You can't just blabber your opinion, and right, so this can have harmful effects as well. Right, one of the most important questions in media always is that who said this, right? Because based on that, you can actually start reasoning that what incentives would that person have, right? And that is why, for example, in news articles and opinion pieces, there's always a small message at the end, right? That who is this author, right? This author is a minister, or he works with the government, or is an academician, or works with some think tank, right? So that tells you a lot about what mindset are they coming from, right? So that can have and all of this is what people then should start understanding, that different stakeholders, different participants would look at issues from a particular point of view and then talk about it from that point of view. Yeah, right. So again, right, bottom line being that creating rather than just flagging of content, right? It's better to create agonistic spaces where discussion and debate can happen. It's better to create institutions who can manage their spaces of discussion, who can manage their public spheres. It's also a matter of responsibility in terms of building media literacy, right? So these things, this also becomes an important aspect that then the technology platforms and managers need to keep into account. If you want to prevent your platform from being misused, then you have to do all of this. Right. There are other issues also. There's been, right, even worker issues that the content moderators themselves have a very hard life, so it's very difficult for them. And right, so it's a slightly different issue. But again, the point being that if you're trying to manage a platform, you also need to be mindful of the workers and moderators and everybody who are helping you manage all of it. Right. So what issues might they be facing? Yeah. Right. So here's another very interesting example from Reddit. Right. Reddit, like we saw, does build a much stronger sense of community. right? So here you have subreddits, and there are moderators, right, who manage these subreddits. That they normally have moderation policies clearly defined. It does go to some distance towards this ideal that we're talking about, right? Of an ideal public sphere where which nurtures institutions, which creates agonistic spaces for discussion and debate, right? So there's this very interesting paper that Reddit used to run a particular program called Ask Me Anything. And one of the employees of Reddit who was managing this was suddenly laid off. And it wasn't very clear why that happened. But the community ownership was so strong that there was a mass sign off of various moderators from Reddit, right, in protest that you reinstate this employee because it wasn't clear why she was dismissed, right? So it's very strange, right? That on the one hand you have Reddit, which is a company, and they can do whatever they want with their employees, right? They can fire, right? They're not answerable to their users. But here we are seeing a very different dynamic that the users, the moderators, are so vested in the company, right? Even though they have no shareholding or anything of that sort, they're just users of the platform that is being run by Reddit. But they are so vested in making sure that this platform carries these values of democracy, of accountability, that they're even questioning the company, right? So once many of these subreddits went dark, the Reddit CEO made some very trivializing comment that popcorn tastes good, meaning that it's a nice movie to watch. That we dismiss this employee, and now so many people are reacting, and so it was a very derogatory comment that she made. That how you eat popcorn during a movie, right? So the comment was popcorn tastes good, right? So that eventually the CEO had to resign, right? And then Reddit got a new CEO at that point, right? So essentially, this tells you, right, that it is possible to build such a strong sense of ownership, right? There's a famous economist, Hirschman, actually created a simple framework called exit or voice. That when you're really invested in an institution, and if you see that that institution is not working out properly, then you have two choices, right? Either you can exit, you can just say, I don't want to be a part of this institution, I'll just leave, right? Or you can exercise your voice, right? So if you feel ownership, then you will exercise your voice to fix the institution, right? And right, it's a messy process, of course, to fix by exercising your voice to fix the institution. But that's the kind of sense of ownership that you want to create if you want your institutions to be strong, right? And to respond to what different users who want those institutions to be working properly, right? How they're looking at them. Yeah. So any questions so far, right? So I hope you're following the broad trajectory, right? That design alone will not get it right. You of course need to manage the design process very well, but even after that, right, you need to manage the deployment. And there are many angles over here with which you'll want to think that one way to manage deployment, right, is to keep understanding are there some social inequities that you're reproducing, and then to fix some of those, to look at downstream effects that your systems are having, and to fix and to change some of these. And one way to do that is through user participation, right? Here you want to use this not just as a, right, not in like simple ways of flagging, but you should ideally have much richer interfaces for this user management, so that you can understand preferences of users can learn from one another, they take an ownership in this process of governing, of running these institutions in a better way. Yeah, right. So the point being that this management is important, and there's many angles that you need to think to get it right. Yeah. Right now, in the same way, right? So we talked about content moderation, but that's not right. You can look at any platform, for example, or any technology, and you'll come up with similar things, right? So, for example, in the gig economy, right, we've talked a lot about drivers, for example, and right, you can think of similar things over there. That are they listening enough to their workers, to the drivers? Similarly, there's work on, right, platforms like Urban Clap, where beauticians visit people's homes, right? So just like we looked at the Uber study, which looked at algorithmic control, here the authors look at other social effects, that because these workers are women, there are safety concerns, right? When they're actually visiting somebody's house, right? How safe is it going to be? Are there some SOS services being provided? Right? A lot of their work is actually what's called emotional labor of customer handling, right? To make sure that they're satisfied. And this is really a soft skill rather than actually just the skill of doing the work of a beautician. So, right, so are their skills being built sufficiently on this front as well? Because that has an effect on the ratings that customers provide to them, right? How well are they speaking and so on, right? So again, right, a bunch of aspects, factors that they discover, which are important when it comes to this work. And then it raises the question that through the technology or through the process, is urban clap, for example, being mindful of all of these things, right? Just like a question was raised, that is Uber being mindful of the control that it is exercising over its drivers, dealing with it. Yeah. So, right, so we see this coming up in many places. I'll skip most of it, but right, same with managing of fake news. So you can look at some of these articles; they're quite interesting, of how financial motives are behind fake news, and then how to counter them. Similarly, right, ratings of apps on Play Store and other such platforms. Right, there's a lot of gaming that happens. So how do you factor all of those in? Yeah, so it's not that straightforward to do that, right? Now, people have actually been thinking about it for a long time, right? So this diagram, of course, right? I just put it up because the motivation is very interesting, right? So we've often talked about cybernetics, right? And Norbert Wiener, we keep referring to his book, The Human Use of Human Beings, right? Which is actually considered to be like the foundations of computer ethics, because it is over here that Wiener started talking about how computers are becoming more pervasive, how computers can actually start learning from data and to start making predictions. And he then carries forward that argument, and he highlights, right, this book came out in 1956, I think. And that, right, from that time, at that time itself, he had looked forward that how this can have an effect on labor markets, on misuse of technology by capitalists and so on, right? So this whole branch of work that Weiner actually initiated, and it's called cybernetics, right? We saw that when we were talking about systems thinking, of the role of feedback, right? So essentially, a lot of people have since then worked on these concepts, that can these cybernetic principles be applied even in a democracy, or for like governing the national economy, right? So, right, it goes back to the same things that we saw in system design, which is essentially a offshoot from cybernetics itself, that you need to model all the stakeholders, you need to understand what are some feedback effects, you need to keep monitoring and instrumenting the system so that you can create counter loops, and you can essentially make it stable, right? So they say that you eventually want to come up with what they call the viable system model, where it's a stable system and which keeps changing with the changing environment, right? So we won't, of course, talk about this, but this is just to show that they envisioned a system where, right, a multi-level system where there are certain rules that operate initially, that goes into right. So you, from that you understand how well are these rules really working. So next level is therefore then how do you change these rules so that better rules come into the system. Then now to change these rules so that you can develop better rules, what kind of awareness do you need? And then gets into how to involve citizens in getting feedback, right? Right. So it was a very technocratic way of thinking about governance, right? But it's interesting, right, that right from that time, people have been thinking about essentially, right, what they call a distributed decision support system, right, which uses feedback from the citizens through media, through right. So they were talking about social media even at that time, and uses all of that to get feedback and to keep changing these rules through which institutions in society are governing society. Yeah. So maybe, yeah. So read this article, for example, right? It's interesting, and these are just anybody who's interested. Most of these are available in PDF forms. Quite interesting to see how people were thinking in these technocratic ways of governing the world, right? And we're also essentially what computer science is. What is computer science doing ultimately? Right? Computer science is essentially computationalizing, informatizing the world, right? As we've talked about it often, right? We're essentially representing the world in data, and then we run algorithms and so on this data, on this representation, to then see how to make decisions and push it in a particular direction. So that's pretty much what we do in computer science, right? We represent the world in computational terms, and then we figure out what how we can change some of this representation, right? So then it goes back into the world, right? Quite interesting how it all builds up from much of this ancestry, right, of thinking, right? And but at the same time, we're also seeing the limitations, right? At the same time, we're also seeing the limitations of these rationalist approaches, that you can't really model the entire world. So it's not that straightforward. Yeah, cool. Yeah. Okay, right. And now on that same track, right? So on that same track, therefore, right, Abhijit Banerjee, who, as you know, got the Nobel Prize for Economics recently, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo and Michael Kremer for their work on RCTs, randomized control trials, right? So with randomized control trials, we've mentioned it quite frequently. So the idea is that if you want to try out a particular policy, you have a control group that doesn't get the treatment, and you have a test group which gets this policy treatment. And they are both selected randomly, so that in terms of initial conditions, they're both identical. And you then look at, you apply this intervention, you observe the effect, and then you compare, right? That places where this intervention was applied, what was the outcome? Places where the intervention was not applied, what has been happening in general anyway over there? And then you look at the differences, right? Right. So this is essentially saying that I'm running experiments to learn how to govern what are good policies to put into place. Now, to do all this, right, this article, they talks about this concept of the learning state, right? State meaning the government. That how can the government learn through these experiments, right? So he says that, well, you ultimately need information systems, right, to see what effects some particular policy is having or not, right? So when you talk about policies right now, so how do you get this information, right? You have to track. So we've talked about NREGA earlier, right? And the management information system, MIS of NREGA, that exists, right? So therefore the MIS has information about how many job cards were given, what wage rates were paid, and so on. So all of that is important, because you need information systems to instrument and monitor, right, what's happening. Based on that, right, you can create incentives that, okay, once the information is being highlighted, you know what you want to highlight, right? It creates incentives. You can create incentives to act on the information, and you can use that to figure out, are the objectives being met or not. So, right, so sounds great, right? Because just like we were talking about the role of users in providing feedback, here we are saying that any systems that you build, you need to have such feedback mechanisms, whether it is through citizens or whether it is through observing the effects, figuring out the inputs and outputs of the system. You are monitoring all of this, right? But Rajendra Narayanan, right, who's a professor at Azim Premji University, right? He wrote a counter article soon after this, which is called The Politics of Information, right? So the point is that, what information are you monitoring in the first place, right? Similarly, what incentives are you designing, and what objectives are you trying to achieve, right? Who is defining all that, right? Here again, we saw when we were looking at the NREGA MIS itself, how the original objective, that this was going to bring in, this was going to reduce corruption, bring more equity, right? How some of these objectives were actually not met, right? So he basically, Rajendra Narayanan basically takes the view that users and the administration have very different incentives, right? The incentive of users is so that, right, they're able to get welfare, they're able to get benefits when they need these benefits. There should not be any unfair denial, and so on. right? So it's more about reducing exclusion, whereas the administration looks at it very differently. They want that the funds should be, nobody should hold them accountable for misuse of the funds, and therefore they are trying to minimize false positive rates, whereas these guys are more concerned about false negatives, right? That unfair denial. So Rajendran talks about what he calls the Janta information system instead of the management information system, right? So he sort of pivots on this term, right? Management information system, he says, is meant for the management, but Janta information system, he says, is what is meant for the Janta, right? So again, right, the issue that we see therefore is that even while you're trying to design, such, ultimately, I mean, this is sort of what RCTs, this is also the vision of RCTs in some sense, right? Ultimately, you're trying to run experiments, you're figuring out what works, what doesn't, so that you can keep doing better and better, right? So this technocratic mindset of solving systems, but this has issues that, right, of who is deciding, right, who is deciding what is being monitored, what objectives is the system being steered towards, right? So right, so that needs to be clear, and that is where politics comes into the picture. And the second thing is what Escobar and everybody have talked about, that there are inherent limits to this representation, right? That it's very difficult to represent such a complex world. So you will again need continuous steering to be able to do that. Yeah. So you're basically seeing that there are many such issues, right? And so now when it comes to user participation, right? So again, this is something we've mentioned earlier, ladder of citizen participation, right? So Shelley Arnstein basically looked at different ways in which communities are involved in governing common resources, or like urban spaces, right? What policies should be brought into play for urbanization and so on, right? So he says that, well, it's a ladder, that it starts with non-participation, where you might include people in committees, but rather you're doing it with a view to manipulate them rather than to take their inputs, right? So you're trying to shape what questions they should be asking, what should they be thinking, right? Next level, slightly better, is right, where you're not manipulating, but you're looking at it in a more patronizing manner, that you need to shape, you need to build the capability to think and participate. So you're basically saying that they're not capable of doing it themselves, right? Right. Slightly higher than that is what is then tokenism, that you get people to participate, but essentially you're just informing them of what you're doing, right? Or you run consultations, you seek inputs, but actually you don't consider those inputs, right? So it's more tokenistic, that people would feel that, okay, they participated in the consultation, but actually, and they gave feedback, but actually you just say, well, yeah, okay, your feedback is noted, but you don't really do anything about it. A lot of consultations in India are basically like this. I've participated in several on health and a couple of things, but I mean, that's the right. You give feedback, but a couple of days later in the newspaper, you see that, well, that thing is actually already being implemented. So your feedback didn't really make any sense. It didn't have any effect at all. Next is application. That we've still taken the decision that we have, but it becomes more of a venue of explaining why we're doing it and so on, right? So it's not that it's really shared, right? True citizen power comes much later, when you actually consider citizens as partners, or you delegate some tasks to the people themselves so that they can run some of it, or even when people actually have veto control, right? That they can veto a policy out, right? So right, so the point being, therefore, that to involve people in the governing process, in defining, right, what are the objectives, what feedback to build, and so on. Right, here also there can be corruptions which can happen, right? That this participation may not really be truly genuine. Maybe it's done more from a compliance standpoint, but people actually don't have much, right? They're not involved in any significant way. Yeah. Right. So yeah, I mean, many of these issues can therefore come up, right? It leads to things being more costly, less efficient, right? Sometimes even minority groups can be opportunistic. So even though you give citizen power, right, sometimes it can also backfire, right? So all of these issues do come in, right, when you're trying to involve people in governing the system, right? So the reason basically why we're mentioning all of this is that even at the management level, right? So you need to do management beyond the design, but there are issues even at that level. Yeah. Right. So just like RCTs, we spoke one other way which technology systems often use is called A/B testing. Right. It's used very often, of course, in testing different user interfaces. Right. And even when earlier we were talking about nudging, right, digital nudging, very early on in the classes, right, we saw that different user interfaces can be built where you have decoy options that are introduced, you have anchor effects that are introduced, and then you can actually see what is the right, how different users are reacting to them. And you can run A/B tests that some users are given this interface, some users are not given the interface, and see what happens, right? So these A/B testing things are definitely done quite frequently on these platforms, right? Just like RCTs, for example, right, are commissioned to look at how policies might be working out, right? So it raises also a question that is A/B testing ethical, right? What are the ethics of A/B testing really? Should we be subjected to? Should users be subjected to this A/B testing? Yeah. So there's a very controversial study that was done by Facebook, where they basically ran A/B tests among 700,000 users, where they wanted to see that what happens to people if they're presented with happier posts by their friends, right, as opposed to more posts by friends who might be sad or who might be speaking something negative, right? So, are users affected by this, and they monitored this effect in terms of what users were writing about, right? So the idea being that if you're seeing a lot of positive news about your friends, one theory is that it affects you negatively because you might start feeling that your friends are having a lot of fun, they're doing very well in life, but you are not. Yeah, and similarly on the other side, that if your friends are sad, then you might become also sad, right? And here you're talking of a contagion effect. So there are two kinds of effects basically that social scientists, sociologists have been talking about. One is this contagion effect, that if you're surrounded by sad people, you'll also become sad. If you're surrounded by happy people, you'll also become happy. Versus the other effect is called social comparison, the social comparison effect, right? That if you're seeing a lot of happy posts, a lot of happy friends, then you might become sad, right? Because you're trying to compare yourself with them. Similarly, if you're seeing a lot of sadness, well, you might feel that okay, you're lucky, you're better off than many other people. Yeah. So which of these effects actually is more dominant, right? And Facebook ran this experiment. So now the criticism basically is that was this ethical, right? Could Facebook have run this experiment? Because Facebook is actually affecting the mood of users. So they did this on 700,000 users. Some users, they briefly made them happier. Some users, they briefly made them sad, right? So it was this ethical. And right, there are, so I'll share these papers. It's good to read. So there's one paper which talks about, which basically criticizes this, that this was unethical. Another paper supports this. Two cheers for corporate experimentation. So the way it is, case is made against this study, right, that it wasn't ethical, right? So first of all, it did not go through any ethics review boards, right? Normally, when you're doing any experiments on human subjects, right, there is you need to get it approved by an ethics review board, right? This, of course, came up more for medical ethics, where if you're actually administering drugs to people, but now this has become a much wider phenomena, that if you're actually doing experiments on people, you have to go through an ethics review board. But this study did not, right? So the question is that, well, all research studies are supposed to go through an ethics review board. Was this a research study or not, right? So the argument is that, yeah, of course it was a research study, right? It was designed as a systematic investigation, and it's building generalizable knowledge, right? It's trying to compare the social comparison theory with the contagion theory, right? Does it involve human subjects? Yes. Is it quality improvement, right? So now the point is that companies are always doing experiments, right, on their users. So for example, hospitals, routinely change their procedures and observe the results. So, for example, hospitals, right, they put up a checklist for clinicians to wash their hands before they saw any patient. And then hospitals, right? So, an ethical approval was not taken for these studies because they were called quality improvement activities. Right? So, even though you followed a research method to arrive at robust conclusions, but they were not, you did not have to, were not required to go through an ethical review process for this because it was called a quality improvement activity. So the question therefore is that this experiment that Facebook did, was it done for research or was it done for quality improvement of Facebook? Yeah. So the argument again that this author makes over here is that no, it was not done for quality improvement. It was done more for research, right? Because right, how can Facebook say that making users happier or sad will impact its quality, right? That you can't, right? You can't manipulate people and then say that it's improving the quality of your platform, right? Because if you have to say that, then you actually need to make a statement that the objective of your platform is to make people happier, right? Is to make people feel better off. But Facebook never says that. Facebook doesn't say that, well, we exist to make the world a happier place, right? So basically, he says that the author says that this wasn't a quality improvement study. This was actually a research study. Right. Then another issue that was raised was that actually the study was done not just by Facebook, but it was supported by academics. So this was done in partnership with some people from Cornell. Right now, academicians, right now, you would say that, well, an academic is involved, so obviously it is right more research oriented. And academics need to go through, any research study needs to go through this ethics review board. Right. But here, one of the arguments that Facebook and Cornell made was that the academic was just giving suggestions on how to conduct the study in a scientific manner, right? And therefore it wasn't their responsibility. But then the paper was published and the academic was also an author on the paper, right? So then you can't say that the academic was just a consultant who was just advising the study, right? And later, so there was a lot of backlash against this paper that I think it was even withdrawn eventually from the journal where it was published because it did not go through the right ethics review processes, right? Right. So the problem also arises that when you have many people working on something, right? Now the company folks would claim that, well, it's quality improvement. The academic would say that I'm just advising them on how to do this quality improvement in a scientific manner, right? But then it's also being published as a research study, right? So it can create, right, these effects that it's not clear who is really the owner, right? And what is the purpose? And finally, of course, one of the most important, that was informed consent taken. Right? So here again, Facebook can argue that where informed consent, we couldn't have done this experiment if we took consent from users. Because if we took consent, it would have created what's called the Hawthorne effect. That if people are aware that they're participating in an experiment, then they will change their behavior. Right? So then what you're trying to study, right, that won't happen. You can only study it in a natural environment where people don't know that they're actually participating in the experiment, right? But over here, however, the argument is that it's actually manipulating people's behavior, right? So there needs to be some better way, right, of taking informed consent. Maybe at least in the terms of service or something, right? There should be some sign that, okay, you will be subject to experiments from time to time. But nothing of that sort was there in Facebook's policy. Yeah, right. So again, the point basically being that, right, even when you're trying to run experiments, right, the same argument also applies to RCTs. That with RCTs, you've randomly allocated different villages or different people to different groups. Some are control and some are in your test group. So let's say your policy works well, right? Then even then it is unethical, right? Because those who were in the test group, they are now better off than those who were in the control group. And why? Well, just because they were randomly selected. Right? So with RCTs, actually, those which are done right with some of these ethical considerations, what they actually do is that they conduct this experiment with the control and the treatment group, and the treatment group might be positively impacted. But after they're done with this experiment, they go back to the control group and also do the same intervention over there. Yeah. so that the control group is not left out. Yeah. So of course this increases the cost of the research study, because now you're actually doing that intervention with many more people, right? But at least you're sharing the benefits equitably in that case, right? And then for all of these other reasons also, right, you need to think about that this A/B testing or RCTs, right, to discover what works so that you can manage platforms in a better way, right? There are ethical issues also that you would need to think through, right? That are important. Yeah. So on the positive side, right, how was it argued that these experiments were good? So it was argued that, well, earlier there were two theories, and now we're actually trying to answer the question. So it's right, we're contributing to knowledge. Then another interesting argument that was made was that there are many people who wouldn't even care about whether they're pushing on social comparison or pushing on emotional contagion, right? But Facebook wanted to find out, right? And so that they could, right, they could have their platform actually, right? So it was claimed that this was a quality improvement exercise, so that it could lead to Facebook doing a better job in recommending content to people, right? So the argument was that practitioner, meaning companies who run these platforms, there are many who just implement A, and they would exploit their power over users or their employees, right? And therefore, Facebook is at least experimenting, so it's at least acknowledging that another option does exist, right? So many people would not even acknowledge that another option B actually exists. They would just keep doing A, maybe because it is benefiting them. So Facebook is at least trying to point out that there are other options, and then it can make a judgment, right? Then they say that, well, terms of service do say that we will have different efforts to make Facebook more safe and secure, and this is part of that. It's about, right? So the argument was that doing this emotional manipulation will make Facebook a better space, and informed consent is implicit because you've taken it through this terms of service, and there's minimal risk, right? So the harm or discomfort anticipated in the research is not greater than that you would encounter anyway in daily life, right? You read the newspaper, you watch news, you use Twitter. So how is this different, right? Because it's very small, whatever harm or discomfort you might experience, and you're anyway subject to all of this. So right. So what this also tells us is that, well, there are different views, right? So that needs to be debated, discussed. So that's one thing. What it's also highlighting is something again we talked about earlier, right? The difference between research and practice. So typically, the reason why review boards exist for research is that research is considered to be risky, and practice is now only applying the research. So again, this is coming more from medical ethics, right? That in medical ethics, you first do the research to, let's say, build a new drug. And then after you show that the drug's effects are correct, right? That it's actually curing the disease, it's not having any significant side effects, and so on. Then you actually release the drug in the market, right? So the practice comes after the research, and most of the risk exists at the research stage. Once you've satisfied, and that is why you go through a review process, ethics review process, and then you do your research by sticking to the protocols you've listed in this ethics review. So you've addressed all the risks at that stage. So once you put it into practice, then you're assuming that no other risk will emerge, right? But with the kind of technology dealing with, it's not the case, right? Because the risks that are being realized once you put something in practice, though these are uncertain, right? So we've seen affordances and, right, so many different ways in which new problems can arise once you deploy something in the field. And right, so this whole argument that research should be subject to ethics review, but not any experiments done at the practice, right? That argument is broken. That argument may apply in the medical ethics space, but it doesn't definitely apply in the information systems, computer systems space, because here these things are actually changing, right? People. So remember also about information ethics, right? That which basically says that we are informational beings, by Floridi, right? Luciano Floridi, right? Who said that we are informational beings, we are affected by the information that we consume, right? Right. So very little of that can be, right? You can try to do that at the research, but it's not done for example, right? Rather, technologies are rolled out, and it is only in the practice stage that you start realizing, right, what issues are arising, right? So all of right, so this becomes an important perspective that you need to keep in mind, that right, when you're right, because with information systems you would need to continuously keep experimenting, but you need to do that ethically. Right? These experiments need to be done ethically. Yeah, so makes sense. Yeah. So this other paper is also quite interesting, right? It's called Civil Servant, right? So they basically say that, well, okay, now given that we want users to participate in experiments, we want to involve the users to define what experiments should be done, and then we can actually conduct these experiments. So they basically talk about, right, building a platform that allows users to discuss and come together to define the research goals, run experiments, and discuss results, and so on. Yeah. So again, it's not been applied much, right? So it's more of a conceptual system that they build, and they build it on top of Reddit, which allows user interaction to discuss things and so on. But yeah, I mean, this again, right? You would need systems like this, maybe designed in a different way. But the point is that when you're trying to govern using A/B testing, RCTs, and so on, you need some wider mechanism for people to participate. Yeah. So there's a very famous book by Karl Popper called Open Society. Right, so Karl Popper is basically in favor of these social experiments. So he says that the other way of doing it is that you have experts, right, who build rationalist theories, and then, right, who say that, well, okay, this is our objective, and they would build systems in line with those objectives. So this, he says, can lead to dictatorships and totalitarian control. So he calls them closed societies. Open societies, he says, are those that embrace social experiments, that the public evaluates government policies so that bad or incompetent rulers can be prevented from doing too much damage. Right? So democracy is, it basically becomes a tool to evaluate different policies. Right? That is, something is working, people will vote for it. Something which is not working, people won't. Society will keep learning through this process of social experiments. Right? So he would basically be very much in favor of things like RCTs, or even natural experiments, right, of documenting natural experiments that might be happening, so that you can figure out, right, what's working, what's not, and then you use democracy as a means to continuously keep selecting the better alternative. Yeah, right. But there's also been a lot of criticism, right, because basically people say that, right, societies need to be conducive to problem solving, right? And we, however, saw that, right, the Rittel and Weber argument on wicked problems, that not everything can be problematized, right? It's not that you can identify problems each time and solve them, right? But in addition to that, you also need societies to be wanting to do the same thing, right? Of solving problems, right? And democracy becomes therefore your technology to select solutions. But what all this is driving towards is a vision of one grand knowledge that we can approach, right? But is that even possible, given the diversity and pluralism that exists, right? So we've talked about wicked problems, subjectivity, right? So there's issues with that, and even if one such grand knowledge is achieved, what prevents that from being exploited by power differences, right? So here we've seen that, right, if the democratic process itself, right, it can be diverted towards majoritarian gains, as opposed to being an agonistic space where people learn and discover from each other. So democracy is not used for learning; it is just used for its voting function, to vote for which alternate is preferred by people, right? So this is a criticism basically on trying to manage or trying to govern, right, not just technologies but any kind of a system, right, where you're trying to govern by continuously running experiments, right? That it is inherently limited, because it's difficult to approach this one grand knowledge. And even if you do, have you really put safeguards in your democratic process so that it's not exploited by power differences, right? So again, right, the reason why we're talking about all this is that we've said that it is very essential to manage, right? But now we're also saying that even this management process has many caveats to it. Yeah, it's not that easy to manage systems. Yeah. So another very nice paper, right, talks about that to do all of this, right? Societies need to have many characteristics. So it needs to be an active society that prefers exploratory innovation to inaction, right? Inaction meaning like a more conservative approach that whatever is there, it's fine. We don't want to change, right? But right, so society itself needs to be motivated, right, to solve problems, to explore innovation, right? They need to see everything as action research, right, rather than right where researchers can action various initiatives. It's an evolutionary learning society. It's an honest society, right, committed to reality testing, to self criticism, to avoiding self deception, right? It's non dogmatic, which means that it will always embrace, right, it will not say false things. It will try to always appreciate criticism. It will be driven by evidence, right? So there are all of these characteristics, and only then can Popper's open society concept really be useful, right? It needs to be an accountable, challengeable, due process society, right? Dissent should be possible. It should be accountable to the people. Decentralized society, where right, because the world is complex, so you need decentralized systems so that you can react to local differences. It's committed to means idealism as well as ends idealism, right? Not just means, not just ends, but also the means, right? The means of getting to that end. So, right, so the process of research, for example, it's not that you can justify something just by the outcome, but even the procedure of getting to that should be ethical, right? It should be driven by equality, well-being, and should take preferences of all people into account, right? So there are many characteristics, therefore, that if you're going with this viewpoint that you can automate governance by continuously running experiments, right, or in this case, right, run experiments and have people vote to select the better alternative, right? There are many characteristics that you need to first satisfy before that vision can actually be realized, right? So these are all of the ways in which even things like A/B testing can go wrong. Yeah. Yeah. So there are all of these, right? In addition, right, there are measurement problems that are you able to measure things correctly? Questions of generalizability, right? So this leads into right problems of informatization. That how much of the world can you really informatize? Right? Are people learning through the process? Are you archiving data properly? Data collection problems also, because right, if you're continuously experimenting, right, it can also lead to survey fatigue, right? The problem definitions, are they being influenced by anybody, right? So there are all of these different issues. This article is also very nice. It talks about validity of that are RCTs as useful as participatory research, right? So essentially the argument is that right, RCTs are right, they're trying to discover context-free mechanisms where the context is not important, right? The mechanism will work is irrespective of whatever context it's deployed in. It's context-free, and right, but rather as compared to something like participatory research, where the communities are trained to observe what's happening and to manage the process themselves, because this makes the communities more aware of local politics, local power dynamics, and they can shape and react based on these ways. This article basically says that participatory research has many merits over RCTs, because in this you're actually equipping local communities to be more learning, to learn and to reflect and accordingly shape their program, right? As opposed to somebody trying to discover context-free rules that can be applied anywhere. Yeah. Right. So again, right. So the point is that lots of ways to think about to do all this. To be able to manage things is not straightforward, right? If you're doing A/B testing or RCTs, you need those will work only in particular settings. But the world is complex, so maybe right, action research, participatory research kind of methods might be better. Right. Similarly, involving users, right, there are challenges with participation that we saw. So those things are become very important, right? Similarly, what information you're using to run these experiments, right? Who collects this information? What objectives are defined? All of those are also important considerations when it comes to figuring out how to manage technologies in a better way. Yeah. One other aspect. After this, I think we'll be done with this module. One other aspect is a way of looking at it is that you involve the users themselves in managing, in figuring it out, right? So here the idea is that your technology has various affordances and users can navigate it themselves. So this particular paper takes the example of social networking websites where there are many features that are provided, right? So you can create profiles and you can decide for yourself what you want to put in the profile or not. So you're not actually representing your true self, you're representing some curated self, right? Similarly, in terms of friend lists, you can choose, right? Should I make my parents my friends or bosses? Should I friend my boss or my teachers, or should I not? Right? Because so you can, so it gives you a space where which is not exactly representative of reality, right? You can govern, you can control your friend list. Similarly, right, you can choose whether you want to comment or not, right? How you want to comment, whether you want to just like and so on, right? So you can use all of these features, and then these social networking platforms also have other effects that whatever information you do share on them is persistent, right? It can be replicated, it can be copied. The potential scalability can be very large, right? So because it can be copied and it is persistent, right? So things could be shared which many people can discover, which normally may not, in the real world it may not happen, right? Plus this content is also searchable, so you can recall it and you can examine it, right? So what the paper talks about is that even though you might put in a lot of features so that users can control the usage for themselves, but it is very complex, right? And right, so I'm sure all of us have faced this, right? That it becomes very complex, right, to manage your curated self of yours, and keep thinking that who will see this content that I share. So what should I share? What not should I share? Could it be searched and recalled at some point in the future, which could be damaging for me, right? So it leads to all sorts of interesting dynamics, right? That there are invisible audiences that you need to keep thinking about. It leads to a collapse of context, which is not exactly right the context that you have in the real world. Blurring of public and private. Right. So there are many challenges, therefore, that this also leads to. Right. So it's not that easy to say that, well, I won't manage anything. I'll just provide a whole bunch of customizable features and users can discover it on their own of how to manage. Yeah, so it's not that simple and straightforward. Yeah, so that's one of the points, right? Yeah, so much of negotiation with technology that people have to undertake, right? What to share, what to believe, what to react to. So there's scope for learning and teaching. There's scope for redesigning. Therefore, all of the setup. Yeah. Right. Then there's other interesting angles also, right? So there are ethnographic studies that were done, right, which tried to see how women or young girls use phones. Because right in India, right now India, right, we are a very patriarchal society so far, and therefore, right, there are taboos placed in terms of, right, the boys could be permitted to share content, but if girls do that, we don't consider that very favorably, right? So they looked at, they did an ethnographic study of several urban women of across different age groups and across different professional and income backgrounds, right? And they tried to see what all tools were they using. And it was very interesting that they found that in urban areas, there was quite a sophisticated usage of smartphones by women, right? So some of them are using locks at the application level. They knew about private browsing. They may not share, right, put in exact profile data so that they could be identified, but maybe some inaccurate information. So people wouldn't know that it's actually them. Right? Or they would not share photos, but only after they were married, they would share some photos, because at that point it becomes acceptable to do this. And then they were able to say that, well, we want to keep a profile clean because it's not just my issues, but I also have to I'm able to talk to my friends and make sure that they don't share some photo of mine. Right? So the point was that they found good evidence that users can do it, right? So it's not exactly like a counter to this paper, but right, this particular paper talks about essentially saying that there are all of these different issues, different factors, affordances which are given, plus certain characteristics of these platforms which lead to people having to think on many lines, and this paper then says that in certain contexts people are able to manage, right? But then we also know how, right? I'm sure all of us would have stories of our own in terms of content that we've shared and issues that some of that has created. Yeah. So there are such things. This other paper is also quite interesting. This talks about use of technology by visually impaired people. And right, so again, the reason why visually impaired people were able to use technology is because, right, so one of course, the technology was designed to be accessible. But what was interesting was that the impact it had, right, on the visually impaired who were using this technology, because right, they were able to right access jobs, right, they were able to use Uber for transportation, and which was quite helpful because they were able to right through, because it's all GPS driven, so they were able to get a transport right at the doorstep. So that's been very useful for in many cases they were able to access content resources and so on, right, less dependency on others. And it also led to how society was perceiving visually impaired people, right, that their friends who would often look at visually impaired as people who need their help, right, but now they saw that, well, it's actually not the case because they're able to inspire other people, they're able to do a lot themselves, right. So the point is that affordances, right, when we look at how these how certain technology features have been used, right, not just in terms of misuse, right, but even how they have been used to lead to certain outcomes, right, that can tell us a lot about how these affordances also shape people's aspirations and how even society views them, right. So again, the point being that these affordances, right, you need users can manage it, and it can be quite useful also. In many cases they are able to manage it, like we saw with women, and in many cases they also bring up introduce new opportunities, right. So on the one hand, it's good if you build technology that can be adapted to different use cases which you may not have even thought about, right. So that can be quite interesting, right. But at the same time also you do see that it can lead to misuse as well, as we've seen with other cases. Yeah. So that's the idea, that management itself is quite a complex process, therefore. Right? There's many angles with which you need to think about, many, right? And continuously keep steering, figuring out, right, what are good uses, what are misuses. Right? You need to continuously experiment while being mindful of the ethics of doing all of this. Right? User participation is good, but again, there are issues that come with it. So as long as you can manage all of it, that's great. Right? So this basically brings us to the end of these 5 very important modules that we've seen. That with practically any information system, you deal with all of these 5 aspects: the user interface, treatment of the data, the algorithms, the system design, and the management of the whole setup. Right. So these 5 things are like fundamental building blocks, right, where many ethical issues arise. And what we've seen so far is what are the types of ethical issues that arise and possibly how to control them, how to make sure that things are moving in the right direction. Yeah. But while doing all of this, we've also seen shortcomings, right? That we've also seen that a lot of it is actually political, right? What objectives are we working towards? Or if you're doing participation, right, is that manipulative or not, right? So now going forward, right, we will shift the gears to thinking more from that point, right, that ultimately, right, so next what we will look at is that there are right, what's the right politics to embrace? Can we answer that? Can we think that what could be a good objective for ourselves that we should try and pursue, right, given all of these different ethical issues, and problems with controlling them, what's the direction that we should choose for our own self. Yeah. And then we will look at similarly other aspects like how even though we might have certain preferences, but when working in companies, when working in organizations, what sorts of issues can arise, and similarly how can the political economy shape, right, what political options we would even have. Yeah, so that's the next set of modules that we will get into. Yeah, that given that there are all of these complex issues, ethical issues to make sure that technology leads to good outcomes, how should we shape our own politics, right? What should we favor so that we're able to understand, right, what and look at, right, what political economy or what organizational issues we might be facing that can prevent us from doing so. Yeah.